By 2016, Donald Trump defeated Hillary Clinton by nearly 4 percentage points. And looking back at that, some smart people believe the difference maker there was African-American turnout that did not materialize for the Democrat. And so having established the swinginess of this swing state, let's get started. And I'm going to you first, Alex. Give us the state of play. What do the polls say?
Well, the race is extremely close. And I think that is bad news for Donald Trump with one caveat that I'll get to. I mean, look, the polling in this race has been consistent, I feel like, really ever since the summer. And I've been joking with Brian Murphy, who is the Washington correspondent for the North Carolina newspapers for McClatchy. Every time there's a poll, it just shows something like 47, 46. Maybe Donald Trump's ahead by a point. Maybe Joe Biden's ahead by a point. But effectively, this race is a dead heat. And I think that there is probably a little bit of frustration for Democrats that it is close, because in many other states, in many other battleground states this year, you have seen a much larger shift from 2016. You had mentioned Donald Trump won this state by 4 points, in 2016, and here it's tied. Meanwhile, Donald Trump won a state like Iowa by more than 9 points, right, in 2016. And if you look at a poll from the New York Times today, Joe Biden's actually leading in that state. So you're talking about a double-digit shift in a state like that. And meanwhile, the move toward Democrats has been much more modest in North Carolina. Now, all that said, I think that's some frustration for Democrats, but the upside for them is they don't need to win North Carolina. Joe Biden does not need to win North Carolina to win the Electoral College. North Carolina is the kind of state that if Joe Biden wins, we're looking at a relatively comfortable victory and Electoral College blowout for the former vice president. So there is some upside, but it's a fascinating state, and Jim can speak to this more, Kristin, because you have these three very distinct groups of voters. You have African-American voters, you have these college-educated white voters, and then you have this more working-class evangelical white vote, which really is the one, as Jim will be able to explain better than I ever could, it's really keeping Donald Trump in the game in North Carolina.
Jim, jump in here. Is Alex right about this? And are the polls consistent with what you see on the ground?
Yeah, I think they are very consistent. I mean, like you said, all the polls have been, showing a virtual tie, a point here, a point there. But nobody really expects this race to come down to more than 2 points on either way. And you're right. The urban areas in North Carolina are very blue now. I remember back when Mecklenburg County, which is where Charlotte is, used to even go for a Republican presidential candidate back in 2000, I think, and before that. But then things have been shifting. The demographics have changed. The big urban counties like Mecklenburg County, where Charlotte is, and Wake County, where Raleigh is, and the Triangle in general, have been very blue. And at the same time, the rural areas and suburban areas have been pretty Republican. Now, one of the big issues down here this year is whether the suburban areas are going to go for Biden or for Trump. And some of the closer in suburban areas have been trending Democratic in the last couple of elections. Some of the ex-urban counties, the outlying suburbs are still very red. So that may be the key to the whole thing right there.
So this is not dissimilar, Alex, from what we see in other states when we're talking about the suburbs, right?
Right. I mean, this is the whole key to Democrat strength in the 2018 midterms, right, was that there was this enormous suburban backlash to Donald Trump. And it is by and large, not entirely, because I think Joe Biden and Democrats are focusing on more of a rural, ex-urban, white working class vote at the same time. But look, if Joe Biden wins, it will be in large part because he performed even better in the suburbs than Hillary Clinton. And so it's that combination tied to their hopes that the African-American vote will not only turn out at greater rates, but that will support Joe Biden at roughly the same rate, or at least approaching the same rate that Barack Obama received in 2008 and 2012, which was key, as you mentioned at the top of the show, to him actually winning the state in 2008, the last time a Democratic presidential nominee did. And there is some question about that. There is, we've talked a lot on this show about the Hispanic vote and some of the underperformance from Joe Biden there. But you do see some of that in the polls in the African American vote, and there's a similar dynamic, arguably. Now it's concentrated among men, and maybe particularly concentrated among young men, among whom some are more Bernie Sanders style liberals, and they're not exactly enthused by Joe Biden. And then on the other hand, you have more moderate members of the community who are not especially liberal and don't like the direction of the Democratic Party, maybe don't consider themselves quote unquote woke. And you see that play out in the state. And this is one of the reasons that Joe Biden, in the last couple of weeks, has actually started to roll out a fleet of advertisements really directly targeting this community, trying to raise his support among Black men. And it's, I think, one of the reasons that he's maybe not polling as well in North Carolina as you would expect, given the overall national shift, that his support, the African-American community, still lags just a little bit. Now, it's a smaller lag than we see with the Hispanic community, but it's definitely there.
Jim, do you see Biden trailing in that way?
See him what?
Do you see him trailing in that way?
I don't think so. Just yesterday he released a couple ads targeted to African Americans in the Black community, and they coincided with his first visit to North Carolina since the primary. He was here in Charlotte, and it was very strange, to see a presidential candidate at a venue where his audience consisted of about a dozen people. They were African American businessmen and teachers and entrepreneurs, and that was his message. He talked about businesses and taxes and education. He kind of talked about the waterfront, but he talked about putting an end to systemic racism too. And so I think he was greeted by the mayor, who's African American, Vi Lyles, but also Chris Paul, the NBA player from Oklahoma City Thunder, who was a Wake Forest star. So he's definitely making a play for that. My colleague, Tim Funk, who wrote a story about a week ago about the Black vote in North Carolina, and found that there were 170,000 fewer African Americans who voted in the 2016 election than the last Obama election in 2012.
Wow.
So that's a big reason Hillary didn't carry North Carolina.